Counting is wonderful, counting is marvelous, counting's terrific, and how...
Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and welcome back to Counting Kryptofreaks. I am really excited about today's episode. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. Today, we're going to watch and chat about Perry, one of my absolute favorite episodes of Smallville. I will show my hand right now and say this one is going to get a 4 from me. Perry is a really neat reinvention of Perry White, and one of the few Smallville episodes that I think does a wonderful job of reimagining something from the original Superman canon by kind of doing the opposite thing with it, but not making it too easy and making it feel really organic and believable. And just overall, the writing in this episode is way above par for Smallville, and it is also a wonderful encapsulation, I think, of what Superman is all about and who the character is at the core. And I think this is Smallville at its best in understanding the core ideals of Superman and the spirit of that character, while also doing a fun and updated reinvention of it. So, so excited to talk about this one today. This is the 5th episode, excuse me, of Season 3. We are on to Disc 2, finally, if you're watching this on the DVD sets. If you want to watch it with me, and I, of course, encourage you to do that, you can get out your DVDs, your Blu-rays, however you want to watch it, get it past all the menus, and get it at timestamp 0. And it also is available on Hulu, if you have a Hulu subscription, and you'll just want to make sure and pause in between commercial breaks if you're watching the commercial version. Of course, if you're new to Counting Kryptofreaks, we have recently changed the format. I'm doing an off-the-cuff commentary now, and I'm still counting Kryptofreaks and other tropes and motifs in Smallville, but it's not scripted, and you can watch the episode along with me as I'm chatting about it. Is everybody ready? Let's get started. Get ready to press play whenever I say now, and that's going to happen right this very moment. Everybody, please press play right now! So right away we see a really curious sight here, a meteor that is coming toward the sun, and the first thing you think is, oh man, another meteor. Are we going to get a second meteor shower? No, folks, that happens later, because of course Smallville had to be silly enough to do even a second meteor shower, but right away our expectations are kind of subverted when that comet is going toward the sun and not actually toward the Earth. And this is going to be the way that Clark is going to find out that his powers come from the sun, which is an interesting choice. He already knows some things about Krypton, and he knows about Jor-El, and he's figured out some things about his origin, although a lot of that, with Jor-El anyway, is more sinister than it will be later, and of course we'll talk about that stuff when we get to it. But usually the way Superman finds out that his powers come from the sun is through Jor-El, because Jor-El is an exposition head that usually just tells him a whole lot of stuff about his powers, and on top of the mythology of Krypton. And he hasn't gotten that because, of course, he and Jor-El don't have a good relationship, and Jor-El is just telling him, or has been anyway, just telling him what to do and trying to groom him to maybe take over the world, or whatever exactly it is that he's wanting him to do. That first scene is really amusing to me, because Clark, just so that he can find out that his powers are connected to the sun, is really excited about something, which is unusual for Clark. Suddenly he has this interest in astronomy that he's never had before, and I don't know that he really will have after this. It seems like he's just, oh, something weird is going on with the sun. This is really interesting, and it's got his imagination going, and it would be, as I've said a lot, really cool if he had specific interests and likes that we could run with in the show, and it would be fine if that was one of them. Now, to be fair, yeah, he's got his telescope, and we have maybe a sense that he kind of likes astronomy before this, but he pretty much just is using that telescope to watch Lana from across the way, or at least he was when she lived there. and I don't know how much actual stargazing he was ever really doing. So that's our introduction to Perry White. Certainly not what you expect from that character. He is at a really low point in his life. I like that he's not just the opposite of Perry White for the sake of being the opposite. Oh, someday he'll be the real Perry White. No, he was the real Perry White, and then, like with so many things in this show, Lionel Luthor destroyed his life, and he's just at a rock-bottom place right now, working for a tabloid television series, doing the least journalistic integrity type work that he possibly can, and he ends up being a really sympathetic character. You, right away, unless you saw the previews for this episode, don't know that you're looking at Perry White right away. And when he reveals that that's who he is, again, if you weren't looking at previews, it's pretty provocative. It's pretty exciting. Oh, really? This guy is going to be Perry White? And even more exciting if you're already familiar with Michael McKean's work, because he is a brilliant choice for Perry White, both as this kind of drunken fool version and as the real go-get-em newspaper editor and journalist that he was at one time, editor that he will become down the road. Once again, really too bad that we didn't get a lot of Michael McKean in this show. He's always been one of my favorite actors. I like him a lot. I've seen him in things like Inherit the Wind and Spinal Tap, a couple things that he's known really well for. He got his start in Laverne and Shirley, which is a thing that I've never actually sat down and watched. He is a villain in a Star Trek Voyager episode that I like quite a bit, called The Thaw, where he plays an evil clown that's in the heads of people having dreams that are all connected to this kind of Matrix type thing, and he's wonderfully spooky in that. And he, of course, is in Better Call Saul, and he's absolutely wonderful in that show. So it was a real treat to have him here, and I want to say he elevates this material, but I think unusually this material was already good enough for him. And I don't know that this episode would be as great without an actor of his caliber, but I really think that it is far and away one of the best and smartest and most sophisticated episodes of Smallville. And I'm not saying it's necessarily one of the most sophisticated episodes of anything on television, but for the standards of this show, it is absolutely remarkable. So Clark's going to start having his powers glitch out on him here, and especially once that starts happening, I would not be using my powers at all on the farm, but this is when he's going to find out that that's going on. And as always, somebody, in this case Perry White, is going to drive up just as he stopped using his powers so that conveniently they can't find out that he's doing that. Like with a lot of Smallville, there is a little bit of convenience to make this story work, but I think it's not as bad as usual, and some of it is really easy to give a pass. I like that everything that kind of comes together to make this happen feels plausible enough. Like, Perry is... it just happens to be coming to town at the same time as the solar flares are happening, but I don't think that's a horribly obnoxious coincidence. And he's not there for Clark in the first place. It's always kind of easy when Clark randomly runs into somebody on the road that has just had a car crash, or in this case, he creates the car crash. And I guess I should stop and say, I actually kind of like that he creates the car crash, because I'm always complaining that Clark pops up out of nowhere with the super speed, and people never see him. And that's even a problem later on in this episode when we find out that his speed has been giving out, and he accidentally runs all the way to Lake Tahoe, and every time his speed gives out, he winds up in the middle of, I guess, nowhere, because nobody ever sees that happens to him. And of course, that is a little bit too easy. But it's nice that there's finally consequences for that happening, and that is a thing we tend to do in a token way. You know, you have Clark finally accidentally getting somebody hurt in that episode from last season, but then, oh wait, no, they weren't actually hurt. That guy was just trying to milk Clark for damages and pretending he had a cast, so I guess that one doesn't really count. But this time we have kind of a token episode where Clark comes out of nowhere super speeding, and somebody sees it, and he has to deal with the fact that somebody may know his secret. But I really like that the reason that Perry White, kind of the contrivance for Perry White not knowing that Clark has superpowers even though he sees them. It's not convenient unconsciousness or anything that easy. It's actually a character trait and a plot point for the episode. This is a guy who is so down on his luck, and he's so broken that he's just drunk all the time. And so every time he sees something supernatural or unexplainable, nobody believes him when he tries to tell them about it. And at the end of the episode, we'll talk about it when we get there, hopefully I remember to mention this, it's going to be a little bit weird that he doesn't bring a camera crew with him when he tries to prove that Clark has powers, and he's just using the fact that he's not sober as good enough. People are not gonna, I guess I'm just explaining this now, people are not gonna trust him that he wasn't drunk when that happened, so I don't know that it's really worth the risk he takes. That's kind of my one big issue with the story of this episode. But I really like that, again, his drunkenness is a plot point and not just an excuse for him not to know what is going on with Clark. We are continuing on with this issue of Lex's potential break with reality and his, well, I guess it becomes a break with reality later on, but right now we're just kind of questioning his sanity and wondering if that island broke him when he had the hallucination with the guy on the island that he killed, and then it turned out that was all in his head. We've been using that as kind of the impetus for Lex's arc this season. And even though the setup for all of that was really contrived and silly, and I still don't buy any of that one iota with what Helen was versus what she ends up retroactively being, I do really like that the question isn't just, will Lex go evil like his father? It's, will he have a break with reality? Will he have a psychotic break, as we'll talk about it later on? And we're slowly turning him into comic book Lex Luthor. And comic book Lex Luthor, like Lionel, of course, isn't just a guy who is taking advantage of people and manipulating people. He's a guy who is a psychopath and ultimately ends, and maybe didn't start that way, but ultimately becomes, I mean, I think Lionel maybe always was, because he's comic book Lex, but this Lex Luthor becoming comic book Lex has to have an actual psychotic break. He has to become unhinged in some way, and this season is exploring that. And so we'll see if we actually buy when he gets to that place and that it happened organically. And I don't love that when he goes into a mental institution this season, it's a thing that is kind of caused by his father and not something that happens organically. But then at the same time, his becoming his father is also about his father driving him insane. And so some of that is okay, but but I don't want it to just be a matter of, you know, his dad, like, drugs him with something, and now he seems to be crazy, and maybe he never was. But I think, I don't know, we'll have to decide as we move along if his actually going, you know, off the deep end later on is light switchy, or if all of this we can actually attribute to that happening. I think Lana this episode is, as she often is, a little bit too melodramatic. I understand how she feels about Perry White, and that she doesn't like that he's drudging up her old feelings about her parents being killed and making her relive that day. X-Files there, by the way, I think is a nod and kind of a joke to X-Files. A lot of the people who work behind the scenes on this show in Vancouver are folks who worked on X-Files, including, as I've mentioned before, Mark Snow, who does the soundtrack for these shows. And that sounds very much like, in 2002, 2003, the name of a tabloid TV show that is going off and pretending like supernatural things are happening and reporting them as the news. I totally see that as, and I guess I never thought of it before this viewing, that that is probably intentionally nodding to the X-Files. So that we're peeling the curtain back with Perry White more and more as this episode goes on. He's not supposed to be sympathetic at the beginning. He's a jerk. He's a terrible person, and we're going to find slowly that he didn't used to be that way, and that he is a real flesh and blood, three-dimensional character that got this way. And I'm very impressed with how much I believe that he starts to come out of it at the end. And it's not, again, a light switch. It's not too easy. It's not I was broken and now I'm perfect and fine, but Clark is gonna inspire him to be better, and that is what Superman is all about, and I really love this episode for that. Going back to Lana, and here she is now trying to get Lex to run Perry White out of town. I like that Lex has a background with Perry White, and once again, I don't think that that's too easy. Lionel has his tentacles everywhere, and I think Lex dealing with his own potential mental unraveling at the same time as Perry shows up, being yet another victim of Lionel's machinations, is a really good way to tie these subplots together. I think this is a super tight episode that gets a whole lot done. It's a really good one-and-done episode that could be watched, I think, by anyone out of the context of this. If you know anything about Superman, I think this is a really fun, interesting episode to watch, but it's also incredibly important for the motivations and the evolution of these characters on a personal level, and I think it's an absolute key episode, even though besides the stuff with Lex's psychology and his having to go to therapy sessions, it's not really pushing along big, it's not like the next chapter of a big story, so much as it's a really important signpost in the lives of these people. But as I was saying, I think Lana is a little bit melodramatic. Sometimes it feels like she's looking for reasons to be angry before she naturally is that way. So while I want to be sympathetic to how she feels, and she's not wrong, she feels a little bit, I don't know if entitled is the right word, but it seems like, maybe it is, like, I'm entitled to act all angry and selfish and obnoxious about this guy who's done this horrible thing to me, instead of trying to take that in a stride the best she can. And again, like, I understand her outrage. It's just she tends to lay outrage on so thick that it makes her less sympathetic, and it makes me appreciate her a little bit less. Now, initially, I didn't love the idea that she was, because I thought she was sort of pretending, acting like, I haven't thought about my parents' death and that day in so long, and he brought all those emotions back. That seemed weird to me because she wore a piece of the meteor that killed her parents for years after their death, but at the end, we fixed that a little bit. Maybe it's a little sappy, but the idea that it's been a few months since she's even been to her parents' graves, and she hasn't been thinking about it as much because she has a new person that she really cares about that has kind of filled that void in her life, and that's Clark. It's an idea I want to like. I don't fully buy it because they don't have the most, healthy and even, figured out relationship. They don't have the most serious relationship. They're not even dating right now. And more than that, though, is just, I've never, even by this point in the series, completely understood what it is that these two people see in each other. And so it makes it difficult to appreciate, you filled in the void in my life that my parents left when they died. With that also, and I'm sure we'll bring this up, I'm sure I'll bring this up every time. I don't know what it is about that shot with the light that Lex walks back out into, but I really like that. He feels like almost a godlike entity sometimes in when he shows up and is able to kind of run people because of who he is. And I don't think he really wants to be that way, but he kind of can't help it, and that's another place where he is more like his father than he would like to admit, and he's going to very much get that way later when he practically strangles Perry White in his office. But anyway, I forget what I was talking about right before this, but yeah. So this is where we're we're finding out that, like with so many people, Perry has been ruined by Lex's dad, and that he had a run-in with Lex a long time ago, and this is the reason that Lex shows up and tries to get rid of him. A lot of people this episode are not appreciating Lex, or excuse me, are not appreciating that Clark is the kind of person who always gives people the benefit of the doubt, and they almost vilify Clark for being with this awful guy in Perry White who will do anything to get a story and doesn't mind exploiting people. And at the end, Clark is kind of vindicated because he sees something in Perry White, and this is something that we do with Clark quite a bit in this show, and this I think is the most effective episode at it. Sometimes it comes off more like Clark is just like naive and like overly naive. So I like that naivety to a degree. I think Superman has to start from that place, but sometimes it's naive in the sense that he's just not even thinking and he's too impulsive. I don't think that's what we have here. This is a lot more like the way he handled his grandfather, I think, and that ultimately didn't turn out well, and this did. Oh, what I was going to say earlier, I just remembered, is Henry Small. I'm probably going to bring him up every time we talk about Lana's parents. By the way, that's a great shot. It looks really good, the tractor being thrown. That seems big screen worthy to me. I like that a lot. But anyway, I don't know if that was CG and just far enough away that you can't tell, but it looks pretty good. Every time Perry sees something he can't explain, it's very funny. This is this sort of like a Q episode in Star Trek: The Next Generation or Star Trek Voyager is, and I know there's one on DS9, but it's not good. Is one of those characters who, and he's not impish, but he is annoying in his way, but is also just really fun to watch and kind of takes over the episode when he's here. And once again, kind of wish we could have gotten more of him, although he would have been a very different person when he came back later. And I realize he does get an appearance way, way later, but it's really unfortunate that he's not the reason that Clark gets his job at the Daily Planet. But anyway, I would think that Lana's feelings about her parents' deaths, I'm not saying that she wouldn't still feel the same way about the man she thought was her father, but it is weird that Henry Small's name doesn't come up in this context, I think. I want to know if when the Sheriff Adams here says that Perry was begging the nurses to get the flying monkeys out of his room, if that's just hyperbole or if that's what he actually was doing. I drink a little. I don't get drunk. I have been pretty plastered maybe a couple of times, and I don't think I've ever been drunk enough to like see things like that. That seems like generally more of a drug-induced thing than an alcohol-induced thing. I don't know that anybody has ever seen flying monkeys because they drank too much, but I suppose with too much inebriation, maybe such a thing is possible. I don't know, but I imagine that was simply hyperbole. I think all of our supporting characters are utilized to their fullest this episode. Everybody gets something to do. Not everybody has a character arc, of course, and even Chloe, who you might think would have a character arc in this, given that she's meeting one of her old heroes, is more serviceable than anything, but I also think that she's important for helping Perry maybe begin to get to a place where he wants to be the man that he once was, and she is kind of bringing back his past, certainly in a more tactful and delicate way. Maybe tactful and delicate, but way than he brought all of Lana's demons back from her childhood. This is deftly executed exposition, I think, where it is exposition that is in the best way possible masquerading as drama. And in fact, I shouldn't even say masquerading. This is a very dramatic scene, but it's also giving us all this background that we need to know, that we began with the exchange earlier with Lex. I really like that he points out the symbols on the side of the barn from that newspaper article from last season, from Rosetta, because when he first sees the Wall of Weird, I found myself looking at all the things on the wall that I immediately recognized as related to Clark and going, how does he not notice that and start trying to put together a conspiracy? And then, and this is when you know it's a good Smallville episode. Every time I start questioning things, because Smallville usually might not be smart enough to actually deal with something and run with something that it should, usually I am mistaken and the episode is going to pick up on that and deal with it. And that is absolutely wonderful. Once again, Pete also is a character that's not going to get a character arc, and this episode isn't really about him, but he is doing research on the solar flares and helping Clark figure out that that is connected to his powers, and develop the theory that once the solar flares end, his powers will go back to normal. We've only had a couple episodes where Clark has lost his powers. The big one, of course, is Leech from Season 1. This episode, and I'm going to go ahead and count all of them separately, he's going to lose his powers a number of times and then keep gaining them back. I think we get some fun comedy mileage out of that, but we also get some good dramatic mileage out of that, where Clark will have his powers go into overdrive, but he'll also lose his powers. And I also like that he's smart enough once he starts... I mean, I think early on, and maybe it's because he's concerned about Perry White and Lana being angry with him for being with him and all of that. I think early on, he's maybe a little bit too, not flippant about it, but he's not worried enough about the implications of that and has to see too many other instances of his powers going out of control before he starts to do anything about it. Once they have the theory, though, I like that he is trying to be proactive in an unproactive way, meaning that he's going to be careful not to do too much, because anything he does, his powers could rush into overdrive, and so he's not going to use his powers, but even just jogging will later on spark his super speed, and there's nothing he can do to help that. So I like that Clark is being smarter than maybe he normally is in this episode, and this feels like the Clark that I want in the show all the time. We've had glimpses of that character in other episodes where he pretty much is this guy, and I think there are 2 or 3 Clarks, and this is the guy who, to me, feels like the kid that actually would become Superman, which is absolutely wonderful. And I wish the whole series felt like this. This is also a really good, tense, dramatic scene, and I think this is even better knowing where it goes later with the psychiatrist who, if memory serves, really is going to be kind of bought by Lionel Luthor. That's what I remember. It's been a while since I've watched this, and at first, Lex is suspicious of her. You have to be paranoid when you're Lionel Luthor's son, and he's expecting that she has ulterior motives, if not working for his father, which he's not suspecting yet, or at least doesn't bring up. It's not about helping Lex as much as it's about having a celebrity patient, and so he just kind of coasts for each of the sessions until they're done. You remember last episode, I think it was last episode or the episode before, Lex agreed to, as he puts it, submit to psychological to therapy sessions, and he doesn't actually go through with it the way he's supposed to. He just talks about his expensive cars and his collections and that kind of thing, and runs out the clock. And unlike the episode where we saw him at first refuse to submit and then ultimately decides to do that with really no opportunity for change that I could see, the opportunity for change is very clear this episode, and we see exactly why he decides to do that, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. This is the scene where Clark is just jogging, and then his powers accidentally go into overdrive on him. And some of this stuff I think is actually kind of funny, not laugh out loud funny, and I like that we don't play it for irritating comedy. We don't have like a, silly soundtrack like some of the later CW superhero shows sometimes do, and this show does to some degree as well, when things are supposed to be funny, where it's sort of like the TOS Trouble Tribbles things. Oh, you're supposed to be laughing now, where the soundtrack serves as the laugh track. We don't really have that this episode. There are just these things that are inherently kind of amusing, but within an episode with a little bit of gravitas, I think. Once again, this just is what I always wanted this show to be. It's smaller, it's personal, it it has larger implications, and it does fun things with the superpowers, but it does fun things with the Superman mythology, which is not a thing that you can do every episode. We talked over the Don't Call Me Chief thing earlier with Sheriff Adams, and maybe I'm just drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit because I like this episode so much in general. I don't want to give everything a pass just because that doesn't work, just because it's in an episode that I otherwise like. But I think even the nod to Perry White's classic, one of Perry White's classic lines, "Don't call me Chief," which you have going all the way back to Adventures of Superman, and is a lot of. I think it's in Adventures of Superman, and it's in the Donner films. I guess Donner film, the Christopher Reeve films. But anyway, that's a thing that Perry White, of course, says a lot, and very often when we do foreshadowing things to later Superman ideas or lines and stuff, it feels really forced, and it feels too cutesy, and that one I really like for some reason. I kind of think that one works. And it seems like a thing that he would say in that moment. It's really kind of condescending, and he's treating this. I mean, he calls the place Littleville, Kansas, with all the Kansasians in it at the beginning of the episode. He's treating this town as quaint and nothing, even though it's, of course, not as small as we pretend like it is. This is a wonderful scene with Lex. And I like that Perry always notes what's going on. He says the jungle living took a toll. He is constantly, again, inebriated, but he's... And the reason he keeps working as a journalist, even for this place with no journalistic integrity, is because, as he says, it's in his blood, and he can't help it. And he still is the man that he was before. He's not lost that, but he has lost himself. If only he could get back on the right bike, on the right speed, which he begins to do at the end of the episode, he could find that again. I think it is just like riding a bike, and he continues to be the that go-get-em journalist with that conviction, and he's always keeping up, and he knows what's going on. And I love that even through this unfortunate persona he has here, I see the real Perry White through and through. It's absolutely wonderful. And I also like that it's through Perry that Lex has that opportunity for change, where that's the moment where he goes, maybe I do need these therapy sessions. Maybe there is something about myself that I'm not understanding, that I'm not getting, and I need to dig deeper and figure out what is wrong with me, because I'm losing myself. And that's happening with a guy who has lost himself, and it was Lionel who caused it, and Lex is afraid of being that person. So Perry ends up being the impetus for some really good drama in this episode, for some things that will propel our characters forward later on, and he in and of himself has a great character arc. This is one of the great examples of things I've seen anyway, I think, of a guest star that has a really good story for himself, but doesn't take over the whole episode. And I have complained about this a lot with Star Trek, where you have episodes where you have this is, by the way, a really good ruse, and I didn't realize what was going on the first time I saw this. They got me with this. Jonathan, maybe I'm reading too far into this, is maybe learning a little bit from the Luthers. This seems very much out of the Luther playbook, but it is I think kind of a benign deception, where he pretends like he's Clark, getting in the van. Now you'd think, from the back of his head, the people in that X-Styles van could tell that is not Clark Kent, but whatever. And they get out and realize, oh no, they pretended like Clark was in that truck, but in fact he's going to go camp out with Pete. Everybody just feels like a real person to me this episode, which is something that I complain about a lot with Smallville, and it does not always feel that way to me. Now, I said Pete is well is facilitating this episode well. He's functional. We still never do enough character stuff with him, and he tends to be somebody there to help Clark do research or to help Clark in a situation like this. But he's at least not just standing around. At least we are using him for something useful, and he is. And his knowing Clark's secret continues to be something that he can use to their advantage and be helpful, and eventually that's going to backfire on them, of course. And I wish we did some more cool character stuff with him before that, and when we finally do get another episode that is really Pete-centered, although I don't know even up to this point if we've had a straight-up Pete-centered episode. I don't think we have. It's going to be a little lame, and I'm going to feel like the character is not exactly who I thought he was before, and that's kind of problematic. This is where Perry says that journalism is in his blood. I like that we're paralleling him to Chloe and her obsession with getting the truth and pushing people and sometimes doing things that seem a little bit morally ambiguous or just not fair to people she cares about, without making this a Perry and Chloe episode, which it could have been, and that might have been okay, but making it more about these two people, Clark and Perry, inspiring each other, I think is much better, especially because Clark is the protagonist of the show, and B, if you're going to have Clark meet Perry White before he goes to Metropolis, and I don't inherently have a problem with that with a reimagining of Superman if we do something interesting with it, which I think we are doing here. If you're going to do that, it's got to be... you've got to have a, like I said, you just have to have a really good reason for it. I like that Perry is still, very important for who Clark is going to become, and when we get to the end of this episode, had we played it right, it would have actually explained something that very often doesn't make sense in Superman lore. And that is the fact that Clark very often goes to Metropolis and doesn't always have a lot of experience under his belt and gets a job at a major metropolitan newspaper. And during eras where major metropolitan newspapers actually make a lot of money and aren't in competition with bloggers and people on the internet. And the idea that he owes him a favor and that's how he gets that job would have been a wonderful explanation and a nice payoff for this, and it's really unfortunate that that's not where we went. Perry has a rope attached to his leg, and I kind of forgot about that. I thought he was actually attempting suicide here. I like that we don't go melodramatic with it. I like that Perry is pretending that he's going to commit suicide. This, by the way, I think is maybe an intentional nod to Superman 2 with Niagara Falls, when Lois does this, trying to prove that Clark Kent is Superman by throwing herself off the falls. Clark is so altruistic and cares so much about people, even if they don't seem to deserve it, that he creates a deadly situation here that wouldn't have been if only he had let him fall to his death, and I absolutely love that. This turns into Perry having to help save Clark as much as Clark is trying to save Perry. A little bit too easy when his powers kick in and when they don't. I really like, though, that this isn't just your standard, like, somebody is in danger, Clark has to save the moment. There's no convenient unconsciousness. There's no moment where Clark's powers kick back in and he saves this guy and nobody happens to notice it happen. This is a, like, Lassie without Lassie kind of moment, where it's just a regular human being save. We've got to help these guys who are dangling over this gorge, and once again, just smarter than I usually see from this show, and I appreciate that so much. I think it says so much about what Clark Kent and Superman are all about, that again, he throws himself over that gorge trying to save this guy, and it was all just a ruse. It was all just a trick to try to prove that he has powers. And what it really proves is how much he cares about people. Now, I don't buy that at the end of this, Perry would no longer think that there was anything going on with Clark, given that just all the things that add up, the pictures on the side of his barn that he saw in the newspaper, and the fact that Lex Luthor is his friend, and he says, like, the Lex I knew wouldn't shake your hand without an ulterior motive. He knows that there's something going on with Clark, and I don't think he's chalking, he's definitely not chalking it up to, I was drunk and the stuff I saw must have been a mistake just because I'm drunk. I really don't think that he believes that, but he knows that something is off because all the things that he thought don't seem to be true now because Clark's hands are bleeding. And again, a little bit too easy that his powers are completely out now. It seems like certain things are not working, and while other things are working, but here none of his powers are working just so that we can make this scene work. And that's a little bit of an issue, but it's not huge or anything. So I would think that he would still maybe be investigating. I also think that, I should have mentioned this earlier, that it's a little bit weird that Perry, just because we know that Clark is Superman and that Clark will be Superman and has those powers, that he assumes that he has more powers than the ones that he's originally witnessed. He's like, so far you're shock resistant, and you're really strong, and I'm wondering what other powers you have. He'd be really disappointed if Clark was a regular Kryptofreak, because most of them only have the one power, but because this is Superman, of course he has to have more powers, even though Perry wouldn't know anything about that. And so, we talked over it, but Lex has decided that he's going to go ahead and go on with the therapy sessions. Maybe he needs that, and he's a little defeated by how far he went with Perry, and we actually got to see what leads him to that place, which I absolutely love. Here is our moment of Clark and Lana in the loft, because we got to have that. And again, this is going to get a little bit sappy when she tells Clark that he's kind of replaced that hole in her heart with her parents. She actually doesn't go that far. That's sappier than what the scene actually does, which tells you how great this episode is, I think. But anyway, usually this would be the scene where we would have some kind of pop song that's kind of singing about the very thing that we're talking about here, but we like to save those for the end. So one tell that there's still another scene left in a Smallville episode very often is that there's not pop music behind it, because usually we like to take the pop music into the credits, and the choice that we're going to have, and of course we have to know that we're going to get one more scene with Perry White, because Smallville, even in an episode this great, is not going to lose its chance to sequel bait or to foreshadow for the future. But this one I like a lot, and I have a really hard time not tearing up in that last scene. We'll see if I do it this time. But when he says, if you're ever in Metropolis, look me up, even though I know what happens later in the show, it still just gets me every time. I love it. But I do question the song over that scene a little bit. We'll hear it here in a second. It's Walking to Memphis? And like, I just don't know why it's Memphis. Like, that doesn't have anything to do with that scene, really. I mean, thematically it does a little bit, but it's just weird that it's Memphis, because, like, we're in Smallville in Kansas, and I don't mean that I want every song to be squarely singing about exactly what's going on, but I find things like that a little bit distracting, where it's like, why are we singing about Memphis in this show set in Kansas? It's weird. I meant to mention at the beginning, because I talk about this a lot, one of the big tells that Metropolis is not in Kansas, that Metropolis is not a stand-in for Kansas City. I like, it might be, but it's a city-state. You know, it's like Washington, D.C. One of the ways I've talked about before, and maybe I brought this one up too, that we know for sure that it isn't actually Metropolis, Kansas, is the license plates that say Metropolis, but they're not Kansas plates. The other one is, we know that he's from Metropolis, Perry White, and when he goes to the Wild Coyote and disses everybody in the bar and calls them Kansasians, well, he wouldn't say that if he was from Kansas, so it can't be in Kansas. That's one of my tells that must not be a Kansas city. I like that Perry White spells out here that the thing that is unusual about Clark is, and yeah, he should still be looking into the powers thing, I think, but the unusual thing about Clark is that he helps people without wanting anything in return, and that is a rare, unusual thing. And I like when he says, I didn't know that there were people like you out there, and that's going to help inspire him to become the man he once was and to stand up to Lionel Luthor. Now, it's rough that we never really know what happens from this, and I'm pretty sure when we see him later, we don't really talk about it. If he goes up against Lionel, one of two things should happen. He should either win that, and even off-screen it might have been nice if Perry's research had, and I don't think it does, I don't think it's ever brought up again. Again, it's been a while, so I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure this is never brought up again. It would have been nice if his research had something to do with helping Lionel go to jail later, but of course that's based on pretty much one instance, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. This makes it sound like he's going to go right to the planet, but he's not there, if memory serves, when Clark finally goes to Metropolis. I like that he's giving him advice about his article writing. Again, I just love it. I love the way he delivers that. In that moment, you see the real Perry White past the drunkenness, past the brokenness, and you just wish you could see it on a weekly basis. It's just fantastic. The great Michael McKean, just perfect casting. Yeah, and he's walking in Memphis. Yeah, sure. So anyway, that's Perry. I love it so much, and like I was saying, it's just great that we deal with Clark's potential interest in journalism. I was talking about earlier about how Clark doesn't really have a lot of real interests and hobbies and things he likes to do, and journalism is kind of just this thing he does because he's friends with Chloe. But Perry sees something in that, and maybe he can build on that and actually make something of it. And I really think that you have two guys that are kind of becoming each other's heroes in this episode, and it's just wonderful. It's just delightful. Let's go ahead and go on to the count now. I don't really have any questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven, so we'll just go right to the count. We've got one car crash this episode. I gotta have one of those with a major Superman character that shows up for the first time, and that, I'm not saying that happens every time, but of course, if you're gonna introduce Clark to someone that is gonna matter a lot in his life later, it's gotta be through a car crash. We've got 23 of those so far. We have a lot of convenient drunkenness, but not any convenient unconsciousness, so we don't have any of those to count today. We also, weirdly, have lots of rude super speed entrances, but no exits, so we can't count those today, but we do have one DC character guest star. Somebody help me out with this if you happen to notice any characters that I've missed with this count. I completely forgot we were counting that when Morgan Edge was introduced. So right now, my count with that into the third season is only 3. I may be wrong about that. I've got Maggie Sawyer and Morgan Edge, and now Perry White. Obviously, there are Superman characters that are in the main cast, but I'm not counting those, just guest stars. And obviously, a little bit later on, we're going to have a lot more of those. We're going to have the dreaded Mixoplick episode. We're going to have a lot of members of the Justice League. Lots of DC characters are going to start popping in a little bit later. We're going to have Green Arrow. But this early on, I'm only counting 3. Is there anybody, even obscure characters, that are comic book characters that I have forgotten to list? Please let me know in the comments, and I'll make sure to add those to the count. I counted just one instance of walking away angry, which I have a hard time imagining with this episode. I thought it happened maybe more than once with Lana, but I only counted 1. So we've got 44 of those so far. We have 4 instances in this episode of Clark losing his powers. I'm going to count all 4 of them. I didn't do that with Red Kryptonite. The last time we had Red Kryptonite, Clark kept getting on and off of it, and I only counted that 1 time for the episode. I'm going to go back and change that count, because I think with stuff like this, we should count each instance they happen and not just episodes they happen in to be consistent. We've done it with Green Kryptonite all the way through. So that brings us to 6 whopping instances of Clark losing his powers 4 in just this one episode, and once again we have one instance of Clark and Lana in the loft, and I don't actually have the full count for that one here. It's 20 or 30 something. I'll make sure next time we get it to give you the full number for that. Once again, I'm going to give this episode a 4 out of 4. I think it's absolutely remarkable, especially for this show. Leave your comments. Let me know what you thought of this episode. Next time, we're going to watch an episode that I think once again really helps this show jump the shark. It is Relic, and it's the episode where we see Jor-El in his human guise way back in the 50s, dating Lana's ancestor, who of course has to look just like Lana, and dealing with a cave and all that, trying to make Jor-El somewhat sympathetic, and already making him a character that doesn't seem anything like what his computerized version is going to be later on. I've never totally known what to make of it. It is very strange indeed, and is kind of this season's Lineage, which is an absolutely wonderful episode, and I think Relic is just bizarre. But we'll go ahead and talk about that next time, and see if maybe it wins me over a little bit this time around. There's things I like about it, but ultimately I think it's really bizarre, and I'm looking forward to chatting about it with you. Everybody, thanks as always for listening to, I should say, Counting Kryptofreaks. I always look forward to the show, and it is so much fun to make, and I hope you had a good time with it as well. Once again, if there's anything I count that you noticed, please let me know and I will add it to the count. I am Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.
Counting is wonderful, counting is marvelous, counting's terrific, and how